Welcome back to Essential Excel. Today we are going to be looking at some formulas, including sum if, and sum ifs. We'll start by looking through each of the formulas, and then once again we'll be jumping back into Excel to work through some examples. The first formula we have to look at today is sum, and simply put, sum gives us the ability to obtain the total for a range of data. By definition, it's made up of the three parts you see on the screen there, and you can see the full formula at the bottom of the screen. But in order to not confuse, we'll wait to get into Excel before we explore this further, as in theory it is actually a really easy formula to get used to and start using to give you some great information. The next formula we'll be looking at is sum if. And sum if moves on from the standard sum formula and now allows us to apply some criteria to our formula so that we can define what we want to count rather than having the overall total for everything we're looking at. So it's made up of three parts. The first is range, and this is the range of cells that you want to apply your criteria to. The second part is the criteria, so the criteria you want to use to determine which cells you want to add together. And lastly, we have the sum range. So this is the range of cells that contain the values that we want to add together. And again, you've got the formula in its entirety at the bottom of the screen there, so you can see how that's made up. The last and most detailed formula we have, and most extensive to look at as well really, but the logic is still straightforward and simple as you'll see when we get into our examples, is the sum ifs formula. So this one is actually made up of 5 parts. But it's not limited to 5, you can actually have a lot more parts than this, but we'll start off exactly in our example as well with just the 2 parts. So the first is the sum range, so this is the range to be summed. So where if the sum if formula we just looked at, the sum range was at the end of the formula, it is now at the beginning of the formula, so that's the main biggest difference you'll notice. The second part is range 1, so this is the first range to evaluate, and point number 3 is the criteria, or criteria 1. So this is the criteria that we want to use on range number 1. Point number 4, so this is now range number 2. So this is the second range to evaluate. And lastly, we have point number 5. So this is the criteria that we want to apply to range number 2. Okay, so having briefly gone through each of the formulas, we'll now jump into Excel and look at an example for each of those formulas. Okay, so we're now in Excel and we're going to go through each of the formulas separately, stepping through each one, and then we'll do an example to show how it works. So what we've got on the screen here is top left hand corner, columns A to C. You can see we've got a table of, or small table of some sales information. So we've got the day on which all those sales were made, the name of the person who done the sale, so these are all our salespeople. And in column C, we've got then the total sales that was achieved. So we can see as an example on here for Monday, Tim did £100. So on Monday, Tim did £100. And there's also another Monday here. So we can see that another chap called John, who he did £125 worth of sales on Monday. So obviously he'd done better than Tim that day. But that's just an example of the data we're looking at. So just really the name of the salesperson, the sales they achieved, and on what day it was. Okay, so we've got the 3 different types on the right hand side, so in column G to H. So we've got the sum formula, the sum if formula, and the sum ifs formula. So let's just step through and look at those once again, recapping what we looked at just a moment ago. So for the sum formula, we can see that there's a number of sections to the formula where you can have number 1, 2, 3, and so on, as much as you need. So an example of that, looking at our sample data. So what we could do is we can actually select the cells that the information was in. So we could say, if we wanted to look at the first 3, so rows 2 to 4 here in column C, and we wanted just to add those 3 values together, the 100, the 35, and the 75, we'd put our sum in to do C2 separated by a comma, C3 separated by a comma, and C4. So you could add enter the formula into that. Obviously this is the 3 parts here, so we'd have to obviously each part is separate, but that's sort of how the formula would look. And we'll do an example of that in a moment. Actually, let's just do an example now so you can actually see what the formula looked like. So let's move away from that. And let's go into this first option we have here in row 11. So what we can do in here is, if we want to do a sum, we do the equals and write the word sum, open our brackets, and we can now see that we've had these options pop up here. So the number 1, number 2, and you can't see it's the ... This is where it'd have number 3 and so on and so forth. So if you wanted to total these first 3 here, what we could do is enter C2, comma, C3, and then C4. And you can see, oh, that's a $sign, C4. So you can see what that's done as I've typed it in there. It's then selected those cells from above here in the table. So if I do close brackets and hit enter, that's going to give us 210, what is the total of these first numbers, or first 3 here, the 100, 35 and 75. Just those 3 there. And what you can actually see as well is when you select a range of cells, providing you've allowed it to be on in this bottom corner, you can actually see the total down the bottom here. So you can see the sum of 210. So that's a good way to get a quick reference of a total rather than having to put a formula in. But back to our example. So to get that 210, we've obviously entered in these separate cell references. But a much easier and quicker way to do it, because our information is all together in the same column, is just to remove that and just select these whole 3, just like that. So our formula has slightly changed. So it's now, rather than putting C2, C3, C4, we only need to put the starting point and the last point of the range of data we want to add. So that being C2 to C4. And the colon symbol you see in the middle there is just to indicate that this is the range that we want to look at. So the starting point being C2 and the end point being C4. So if we close our brackets and hit enter there, we can see we've achieved exactly the same total, that 210 there. Cool, so that's the example, but just to carry this on, because we don't want just the total for those 3 rows, we actually want the total for all the information down to row 7. So to do that, all we need to do is step back into our formula, and we can either click and drag this column here, so you can see this little square icon in the bottom there of the range of data, where it changes to those arrows. You can either click and drag there to extend the range down the column 7, and you'll see that's updated here and at the top there. Or alternatively, if we go back to where we were, you can just add in here C7 rather than C4 and hit enter. And there you go, you've got the total 465. Do our double little check. So if we highlight all those rows there, and we can see that, yeah, our quick summary is giving us the 465 as well. So that is the sum formula. So even though in our examples we looked at earlier, we mentioned about the different parts being number 1, 2 and 3, in all fairness and honesty, it's a lot more common and easier just to use the sum in this, as we've used it here, just selecting the whole range of which we want to add, and then we get the total that way. Another way you might want to use it is, or where you would want to use the comma to separate the numbers, is if your cells weren't in a straight line. So if they were maybe spread across the page or they weren't grouped together, that's when the commas would come in handy to select the cells or what you want to add together. Okay, so what was now done there by using the sum formula, that tells us the total number of cells for all information in our table, so 465. But our second example here wants us to just get the sales by Tim. So forget everyone else and only give us the total for sales that are made by Tim. So what might be easier is to quickly step over to the right hand side here to our little section for SUMIF, where we've broken it out by each section of the formula. So the first part of the formula is, because we're now actually going to be adding criteria to define or tell the formula that we only want to add the sales that belong to Tim. So the first thing we're going to do is, in this range section here, is we need to find out where Tim is in that range. So the range that contains Tim's name, or the names of our salespeople, is in column B. So what we'll do here is we can enter range B2 to B7. So that'll look like this, B2 to B7. So what that first part is going to do is going to look in that range of information. What you can do as well is, we've entered the range, obviously being specific of the row numbers. if we didn't have our summary at the bottom here in rows 11 to 15, you could just select the whole column. So that would look like this. So just select the whole column of B, and it will just look down that whole column. But what we're going to do, because we're looking at that specific range, because of we have got information below, we're just going to put in the exact range of B2 to B7. Cool. So what do we want to look in this range for? What's the criteria to apply to B2 to B7? Well, our criteria is Tim, so we just need to enter the name of Tim. And the last part, the sum range, so the cells that we want to add together. So simply put, this is going to be our column C. So it'll be the same as what we entered for the range, so B2 to B7, but this time in column C. So it's going to be C2 to C7, like that. So what we're going to do is look in this range in column B to find where Tim is, and then add the corresponding sales totals for where the Tim appears. So what it will do is it'll go down column B, it'll say, there's Tim there, get that information, and it'll add the 100, and then what it'll also do is find that Tim is also on row 6, and then add the 80, so that will give us a total of 180. So let's enter that formula now into row 13, where we've got sales by team using the SUMIF formula that you can see in column D. So to start, we do the equal sign, and we enter sum, but this time if, SUMIF, and open our brackets. So the first part we've got is our range, so we can see that that is B2 and B7, so let's select those. We'll then enter a comma to move on to the second part, which is our criteria. So we want to look for the name Tim, so what we'll do in speech marks is we'll write the name Tim, and close speech marks, hit comma to move on to the last part, what's the sum range. So having found Tim in column B, we now want to get the total of his sales from column C. So we'll just select that. So these values have been exactly the same as we've got over here in column I. So let's then close brackets and hit enter. Perfect, so we've now got our 180. So this is the total sales that Tim has done. So we can just validate that by saying, yep, there's Tim here, so we've got the 80, and we've also got Tim at the top here with 100. So the two of those together being our 180. Perfect, so that's the SUMIF formula. So the last formula we have to look at is the SUMIFs. So this just takes SUMIF that one step further, and rather than just using one piece of criteria, with a criteria previously being the name of Tim, we can now add more than one piece of criteria. So what's our example? We want to know the sales by Tim on a Monday. So it's the same as our last formula in regards to what we're trying to achieve, but this time we only want to find the sales by Tim that he done on a Monday. So it's just adding that little extra detail in there as well. Okay, so what we'll do is again go over to the right hand side here for SUMIFs, and we'll step through each of these pieces of information. So comparing to the SUMIF formula we had, SUMIFs is like I say, it's the same logic, but it's in a bit of a different order that the information comes in. So what we start off here is where, like I say, previously in the SUMIF, the sum range that contained the values we want us to add together was right at the end of the formula, whereas now it's going to be at the beginning. That's to allow obviously space for entering our different ranges and our multiple criteria. So the sum range is the same as SUMIF in this scenario, so it's going to be C2 to C7, because that's where the values still are in column C. So the first range to evaluate, so this is the first piece we want to do, and we'll start as we did with the last one. So the first thing we'll look for is where we have the name Tim. So that's going to be again the same as the last one, so it's going to be B2 to B7, B7, and the first piece of criteria is again to find Tim's name. So far we're exactly the same as our SUMIF formula, albeit the range to be summed is now at the beginning rather than being at the end, or the third part. Okay, so now we move on to our second range. So this is now where we're going to enter the additional piece of information to ensure the formula only adds up the values that were recorded on a Monday. So exactly the same as Tim, but this time we're going to obviously incorporate the column A. So to do that, we want to select the same range. So we've got A2 to A7. And in this range, we now want to find out Monday. So again, the same as we do with Tim, we're going to obviously enter the search term for Monday. So to recap that, we're going to sum the values in column C, but only those where Tim is the name in column B and Monday is the day in column A. Cool, so step over the side here and enter that into our formula. So to start again, got our equal sign, sum, and this time we're going to do IFS, so sum ifs, and open our brackets. And once again, we can see the various parts of the formula broken out for us here in this pop-up box. So the first part, as we can see over the side here, is the sum to be range, so the sum that contains the values we want to add together. So we can simply select that by doing C7 or C2 to C7, and then hitting the comma to move on to our first piece of criteria. So the first piece is column B to find the name Tim. So we shall select column B, or rows 2 to 7 in column B to be more specific, comma, to enter our now criteria. So criteria range 1 and criteria range 1 and criteria range 1 and criteria 1 obviously together. So for that criteria range number 1, we want to find the name Tim. So again, when we enter it into the formula, we have to do it around quotations. Obviously, we haven't done it on our example in column I to the right-hand side, but when entering into the formula, we must make sure that any text has got the quotations around it. Having done that, we hit comma, and we can now move on to our second criteria range. So this time, we're going to use the values in column A, all the days, so A2 to A7. Hit the comma again to now put in the actual criteria we're looking for, and it is going to be the day Monday. So let's enter Monday. Do our last set of quotations there as well, because it's around the text, and then we're going to close our brackets, and then we'll hit enter. Okay, and then that's our value there. So we can see that sales by Tim on a Monday was £100. So we can check that by looking down here. So we know previously that Tim had 2 records on here. So he's on row 2 and row 6. And when we looked for Tim, total sales just by Tim, we had 100 for him on row 2, and we had £80 for him here. So the total he's done is 180. But obviously now we're looking to see those on a Monday. So one of these sales was on a Wednesday, so we won't be counting that. So that's no good. But the only one we will be counting with this logic is obviously on row 2, Monday, Tim, and £100. So what we can do as well, because all these formulas are dynamic, and most importantly looking at this sum ifs one here, just for my last example, if we were to change the day on row 6 for Tim, not that it would really change in terms of data, but just for the example, and we put in here Monday, we can see that our formula is now picks it up because it now meets our criteria of also being Tim in the name and now being 2 sets of data from the Tim on Monday. What happens to give us the same value is the total sales for Tim. That concludes our look at the Excel sum formulas. As always, if you have any questions, please drop us a comment below or reach out to us on our Facebook page. It'd be really appreciated if you could give this video a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel to make sure you don't miss any of our future videos. We'll see you in the next video.